Thank you, Noach. I admit indeed that I am an economist and actually a macroeconomist, which means usually someone who views the world from high above. I have the luxury of not going into details, but still economists and even more so macroeconomists are getting interested more and more in income distribution in the recent decades. So I'd like to say a few words about that in general. And also, I will, at the end, come also to Israel. Okay. Where's my presentation here? Okay. So the economic questions on inequality are very simple. First of all, rich men, poor men. What makes some people rich and others poor? What determines the degree of inequality within a society? And does it have to do also with economic policy? In other words, with what governments do? And on the other hand, what are the effects of inequality on the economic performance of the economy? In other words, does the way we divide the cake have an effect on the size of the cake? So this is another question that we have. Okay. Of course, we are far away from having full answers. And the paper that Noach described before, which I will give you a briefly description of, was initially a very theoretical paper, but there has been an accumulating empirical studies on that, and I'll tell you a little bit about them as well. Okay, let me first say that with all due respect to the inequality in Israel, and even in the US, which are very high, the big inequality in the world is across countries. And the amazing thing is that most of this inequality is pretty recent. This data, by the way, is from the research of Angus Maddison, a great economic historian who died 3 years ago. And you can see here, I mean, this is really a broad stretch, kind of going from the year 1000 to the year 2000. But what's interesting is, of course, what happened since 1820, which is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, less than 200 years ago. And the gaps between countries increased enormously during these years. So the phenomenon of very rich countries relative to very poor countries is not something that we lived with for eternity. It's a new economic phenomenon, and it's the result mainly of the running away of the rich countries from the others. So in other words, there is huge development of the rich countries, and the poor countries, for various reasons that we don't fully understand, are not fully successful in catching up with them. So if you look, for example, between the richest area, let's look at what Madison calls Western offshoots, which is basically the US, Canada, New Zealand, etc., the countries that people who came from England. They were 3 times as rich as Africa 200 years ago. Today, it's something like 20 times rich. So and these are gaps between regions, which are averages in themselves. So the gaps between specific countries can be even much higher. As for explanations to that, we don't have many explanations, but in a recent study that I'm doing with 2 Italian colleagues, we find that these gaps are not only high, but they're still growing over time. So some of the countries, even now, are not fully catching up with the frontier, which is the US in our study. So this is something that we really have to find explanations for, and we are short of an agreed upon, accepted explanation for that. So this is important to remember. Now, inequality within a country. We usually think about the interaction of 2 markets. One is the labor market, and the other is capital market. And that touches a lot upon the project of the book, opportunity that we have seen before. The labor market is, of course, important because, first of all, it determines the gap between capital owners and workers. But not only that, there are also gaps between different workers. And what we know for already 50 or 60 years of research on human capital, that part of the gaps between workers is due to education. And investment in education is something that is related to the capital markets. We need to invest many years ahead of time, and most of the investment is not even done by the same individual. I have to invest in the education of my children, and they will be able to pay back sometime far away in the future. So this creates a significant market failure, because a lot of the investments that should have been made according to pure economic theory are not done because of lack of financing. Now that was, of course, acute in the 19th century when there was almost no public education. But as the study we've seen before shows, this problem exists even under public education because the effect of the ability of the parents to buy additional education to the children, or the ability of the parents to move to neighborhoods and areas where the schools have higher quality. All this is impacted by capital markets. If capital markets were functioning perfectly well as they do in economic theory, I could have bought an apartment in the best neighborhood in town, promising that when my child will become a lawyer, he will pay back. It doesn't work. And that's why we need public intervention, and the most common public intervention here is, of course, public education. Okay, let me go a little bit to the case of aggregate wages. And one of the main problems that we have seen in the last 14 years in Israel, and we have seen it in the US almost since 1980, is that wages stopped growing at some point. And I'm talking about real wages, average wages. This graph shows the situation in Israel. In the US, it's pretty similar, but the divergence starts at 1980, which means we still have a long way to go in Israel.
What are the two?
Okay, I'll explain in a moment. The blue line is output per worker in the business sector. So this excludes the public sector. The public sector doesn't change the picture a lot, but I focus here on the private sector. The red one is real wages. All of them are in logarithms, so the slope gives you the rate of growth. So we can see that the rate of growth of the two variables was pretty much the same until 1999, and since then, output per worker is growing fast. The wage rate is kind of stagnating. This is all the wages in the business sector and the output per worker in the business sector. Again, if you do the same thing in the overall economy, you get a similar picture. This is something that we have observed around the time of the popular revolts in 2011 when we worked on these issues. Okay. What are the main reasons for inequality in the labor market between different types of workers? One of them is the weakening of the labor unions, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that. Another is, of course, globalization and competition either by foreign workers or competition by imports from other countries. And also differences in education, and here we go to my own study. So first of all, with education, we have to remember that education is considered by economists to be a wonderful investment. It's a great thing to do because the rate of return on education is very high. Every year of schooling, and these figures are the averages of many, many studies of all kinds of wage regressions and the affecting of schooling. So we think the summary of the average of all these studies is that in the first 4 years, every year of schooling adds 13% to wages from that time on. From fourth grade to 8th grade, the addition is 10%. and from the eighth grade on, it's 7%. So these are significant numbers, and this is an investment that should be taken by everyone, if possible, of course. And the problem is, of course, getting the financing done. And the paper that you mentioned, Noach, Galor and Zeira 93, but I must say that we had a paper that came before us by Lowry, but Lowry was looking only at some aspects of the problem, but we added to it the macroeconomic perspective and also some additional view of indivisibility of investment in human capital, which is important, because it's not enough to go to 1-year college or to 2 years college. You have to finish college, so which means that you have to cross a bigger hurdle. So financing becomes much more important as a result. And we show that as a result, the amount of education in a society depends not only on the average income, but also on how income is distributed. Because if there are a small group of people who can afford education and a large group of people that cannot afford education, the result is that there will be less education, less educated people, and as a result, less skilled workers, and that may affect GDP as well. So what we claimed there, that the relationship between inequality and economic growth was significant, and it was due to education, to opportunity, to education attainment. And of course, one of the ways to cope with it was by public education that increased significantly, but we have to remember that public education is not easily available to very poor countries, because very poor countries lack the ability to collect a sufficient amount of taxation in order to build a good enough system of education. So following, just to give you an idea about how the situation can be bad in some poor countries, these numbers are taken from the new website of Barrow and Lee on education, on education attainment across countries. And these are the figures, the percentage of the population above the age of 15 that had no schooling whatsoever. I mean, 0. So Portugal, in the midst of Europe, in 1950, only 46%. Spain, 57%. Turkey, 79%. And now the others are countries that do not belong to the developed countries, but they are poor countries. But here I bring the data both at 1950 and at 2010. And you can see that some of these countries still today have a huge percentage of people with 0 education, like Morocco, 44%, Yemen, 57%, and some countries in sub-Saharan Africa, like Gambia, 65%. So these numbers are staggering and depressing. And we have to keep them in mind. I mean, not that it's not important to improve education for the poor in Israel and in the US and in many other countries, but we have to remember that the access to education is costly, and it will not be solved by the free market. Because here is an example where the government is not capable of creating sufficient levels of public education, and this is the results. Okay, so as a result of our studies that came up in the mid-90s, there came a lot of empirical studies that tried to check whether indeed high inequality has a negative effect on economic growth. And I must admit that these studies are quite problematic. I mean, they're called growth regressions, and we have a lot of things to say in critique, and I fully respect what you said before, that we should first try to describe things rather than determine causality. Of course, there were tricks used in these studies to determine causality. For example, people took the economic growth throughout the period, and they took the level of education or the level of inequality or the level of some initial other thing at the initial period. So, of course, this doesn't solve the problem of causality fully and not even partially, but anyway, what happened after the mid-90s that people started to add to the standard growth regressions also the variable that measures inequality, and the most common one was, of course, the Gini coefficient. So both Alesina and Roderick from Harvard and Persson and Tabellini from Europe found that it has a significant negative effect. And later on, there were many more studies who checked it from other angles and thought that sometimes the effect was not so significant and so. Actually, the latest kind of authoritative paper on that was from Barrow, who actually started this line of literature of growth regressions. And Barrow found out that there is a strong negative effect, but it's only for the group of the poor countries, while for the group of the more developed country, the effect is kind of not significant. And one of the explanations could be because the rich countries have a better system of public education. And public education mitigates, to some extent at least, the effect of background and families and things like this. Again, this is my hypothesis. I wanted once to study it more thoroughly, but the project didn't work out. So, but it will be done somehow and by someone, probably. Another effect of inequality on economic growth is the problem of low wages. A lot of economic growth is achieved by technological progress, technical progress, and the adoption of technology. It's not enough to have new machines or new inventions. You have to adopt them and use them. And sometimes the adoption of a technology depends also on the prices of the factors of production. And the main reason for that is a lot of the technologies that we face are in the shape of machines that replace workers. You can think about the 19th century, about the steam engine and the other weaving machines and stuff, but we can think even today. We have computers that do it. We have many other machines that are replacing skills and actions that were done before by individuals, by human beings. And when you need to replace a human being, then the wage you pay is crucial. If you walk out in restaurants and bars in Jerusalem, you will find very few electric dishwashers. Why? Because there's some Palestinian from East Jerusalem who does it for a very low wage, by hand. But if you go to a European capital city or a big city in the US, in every bar and every restaurant, dishes are cleaned by an electric dishwasher. And you can have a lot of such examples. So the level of wages has an effect. And one of the nicest examples is, of course, the construction sector in Israel. Construction in Israel until the late 60s was done by Israeli workers. And they got pretty good wages. And technical change in the sector was something at the rate of 3.8% a year. And then in 1970, foreign workers from first of all, from the Palestinian territories came in, and then in the 90s they were replaced by people from China and people from other countries. But still, technical change in the construction sector in Israel stopped. It went down from 3.8 to 0.7. Of course, there was also a reduction in the rate of growth, which contributes to that. But even if you compare it to industry, the rate of growth of industry was 30% higher before 70, but was twice as high after 70. So there's clearly a gap and a difference. Okay, I raised another question, is there a relationship between inequality and economic policy? And this is a simple graph, not a high-tech regression. This is a simple regression that takes, on one axis is the share of public expenditures in GDP. In other words, how big the government is, which is a regular measure for what we usually call the welfare state. And on the other axis is the Gini coefficient. And there's clearly a negative correlation between the two variables, which means that if the welfare state is more developed and the government expenditures relative to GDP are higher, inequality is lower, and vice versa. So this is something that shows that the two things are kind of strongly related. We cannot ignore it. Now a little bit about Israel. Inequality in Israel can be measured in many ways, and in all the measurements that we can use, it increased over time. This measurement is the simplest one in a sense. This is the share in income of the top of the 1%, the top 1%. So it was something around 7% in 1970, the upper diagram, and we're among the more equal countries, but again, not the most equal in the world. Let's not kind of brag too much about it. But nowadays, we're basically second after Argentina and the USA. So if we consider Argentina to be a less developed country, then we are second after the US. And you'll get a similar picture if you take the Gini coefficient as well. So this is one thing to remember, that inequality not only increased in Israel over time, but our inequality relative to other countries increased significantly. So once we were relatively in the middle, a little bit even more to the equal side, and now we're much more unequal. What are the explanations for that? I gave you one explanation by looking at the real wage. There is a very significant weakening of the labor unions. If at 1970s we had 80% of the workers were unionized, now it's below 30%. There is a huge privatization of the public sector jobs. I'm not talking about privatization of companies. I'm talking about privatizing jobs, outsourcing public service jobs to manpower companies. One way to measure it, which I find quite useful, is to look at how public expenditures, civilian, are split between wages and purchases. And there is a huge change over the years. So in 1980, 83% of public civilian expenditures were wages, while only 17 were purchases. And today, in 2010, it went down to 59 and 41. So there is a huge change. I think that there is a similar change also in military expenditures, although there it's a bit more difficult because purchases were always higher. But I mean, I remember the army when I used to serve, where we used to prepare our own food, and nowadays it's subcontracted to other companies, just to give you one example. So that's another reason, and there are many other reasons, part of it related to Haredi Jews and to Arab people who usually earn lower wages, and when their share in the population increase, that increases the inequality and reduces the wage as well. Now about public expenditures. This is a very important diagram, actually. It describes the whole fiscal policy of Israel within one diagram. This is really a bird's view. It starts with 1960 because I have data before, but it's not on a continuous basis, and it ends at 2010. The blue line is the expenditures, the black line is the revenues, the red line is the deficit. So it's true that we went through a traumatic period in the 70s and the 80s when expenditures went high, primarily because of the defense problem, because we had serious wars and serious, I mean, just to give you an idea, defense costs alone at the top of the period were around 33% of GDP. So 1/3 of what we produced went to defense, and basically even more, but these are the direct costs. But after we stabilized the economy in 1985, you can see that the trend of reducing government expenditures is going on. So what we have in the last 20 years is a continuous process of reducing the size of government. Not because the deficit is too high. You see, the deficit is pretty stable. And it's in good size because the debt to GDP ratio went down significantly during this period. The result is, of course, ideological. There is a policy by the government, and actually all governments, Labor, Likud, you name it, doesn't matter. They all share the same policy of reducing public expenditures, and part of the reduction is, of course, also education. Education went down from 8% to 7%. That's a small reduction, relatively, although it's much bigger in effect because at the time there was a huge increase in demand for education because of the introduction of colleges into Israel. Health expenditures by the government went down from 3.7 to 2.6, which is a much bigger drop. And the largest drop, of course, was in housing, not surprising. Housing support by the government went down from, in the mid-90s, from 1.5% to 0.5% of GDP. So a decline, a significant decline. That's it.
Thank you very much, Yossi. We have a few minutes for questions or comments that people would like to raise. Yes, please, Daniel.
You mentioned as one of your first remarks the relationship between productivity and wages. How would you look at the service sector? Because there it's more difficult to talk about technology, etc., and how important it is.
I usually don't distinguish between.
Sorry?
I usually don't distinguish between services and other sectors. Part of it because the service sector is the largest in the economy. You mean public services?
No, I mean services in general. They are much less affected by technology changes, and they are very populated by low-skilled labor.
Well, first of all, it depends. I mean, I'm providing services too, but I hope I'm not low-skilled yet. I mean, I'm in that direction, but let me. I don't think there is a large difference. I mean, technology matters. I didn't present the figures here, but I am writing now a book about the Israeli economy, and one of the things I'm trying to break down is the economic growth in Israel, and how can we account it for various issues. So at least between 40 and 45% of economic growth in Israel, at least since the beginning of the State of Israel, should be attributed to increases in human capital. So education and human capital are key factors, not 100%, not even 50%, but 40% and more. Now, the rest of the 60%, I think basically it was catching up with technology because we started much late. We started with a lag. So I just want to remind people that the rapid growth of Israel is not today, and actually we're growing at the same rate since 73. The period of rapid growth was the 50 years between 1922 and 1972. From 1972, we're growing at approximately the same rate. But in the years 1950 to 1970, I checked a number of technological innovations and the rate of their adoptions, and compared it to the rate of adoption in the US, and the rate of adoption was very rapid. There is a beautiful set of data by Komin and Hobain, which is related to a paper they published in 2010, and they kind of list the adoption of various technological innovations in the last, well, they cannot go back too much in some innovations, but they go over 160 countries, I think something like 50 different types of innovations. And I looked at major ones, like telephone, tractors, combines, airline kilometers, things like this. And the rate of technical progress in Israel during the 50s to the 70s was immense. So technology plays a role. We cannot ignore it. I mean, this is one of the main messages of the new growth literature that started in the early 90s. I mean, technological progress is important. It's important globally. The question why it is important between countries is something we don't understand yet. Why poor countries don't adopt some technologies very rapidly is a mysterious question. I suggested before one of the answers is the low wage rate, but I'm not sure that it's the only one. Yes?
More? Any? Me? Okay.
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
please.
You talked about capital markets and basically liquidity constraints as being a significant reason for inequality in educational outcomes. And in elementary, secondary education, where if there's no public education, it's hard for people to pay for it, that's really clear. In the United States, certainly, liquidity constraints don't seem to be a big explanation for inequality in post-secondary education, because actually you could borrow the money if you want to. So how do you put that into perspective?
I don't think that the attainment, the achievements in education are determined at the post-secondary stage. I think they're determined mainly in the early school, secondary school maybe, but preschool even. I mean, I think that is shown in a lot of the studies, in a lot of the research that was presented in the book as well, as far as I can understand it. Because there's a small problem. No, I mean, if a child doesn't speak the right way and the right jargon and the right terminology from early on, he will have a difficult life later on going to college and maybe even finding a job. So a lot depends on the early stages of education. As you could see in my data, like the wage regression studies and all the studies of human capital show that the return to education at this stage is the highest. It's 30% every year, while at the later stages it's 7% and even lower than 7%, which still I suggest that everyone should go to college, but the returns are lower. But I would also not call it liquidity constraint per se, because it kind of, liquidity is the situation where this week I don't have enough money to buy this sweater, so I'll buy it next week. I mean, this is kind of a capital market imperfection. It's much deeper, because it hurts at the main assumption in the benchmark economic model that says that you can borrow or lend any amount at the same given interest rate. And that it is problematic. So it shouldn't necessarily be only liquidity constraint. In our paper, it happens where you can borrow, but you borrow at a much higher interest rate because you're considered to be risky or you're considered to be something. And it's sufficient that you borrow at a much higher interest rate that at some stage you will come to the conclusion that it doesn't pay me to invest in education. Because as high as the rate of return is, if I have to pay a much higher interest rate on borrowing for getting education, forget about it. I'll go find a job.
Rami, last question.
Okay. I was wondering, you mentioned again and again public education as a way of, as an investment and as a way of, in a way, lessening perhaps inequality. But the question do you have any data about to what extent public education is a way of reducing inequality? Because the public education can be very useful for some groups and increase their advantage while not really improving the status of other groups.
I'm not saying that public education is perfect. Far from that. What I was saying just, and again, you should look at it at a historical perspective. When the Industrial Revolution started in the 19th century, there was no public education. And as a result, a small minority, and I've given you before the numbers in some countries, and the rest of the countries were like them. So only a small minority acquired education. And the problem was that we needed more education for the workers. I mean, the emergence of public education was not only because there was a market failure there. There was a market failure always. But in the 19th century, the demand for skilled and educated workers, even simple education, became enormous. Because you couldn't teach your children what you learned, what you did. So human capital couldn't be inherited from parent to children or from a craftsman to the assistant as before. It should be done because technology changed every 10 years, every 5 years. So you needed to cope with it in different ways. So there was a need for that, and therefore public education became almost common. As I said before in one of my questions, 85% of education costs in the OECD countries are financed by public money. So, of course, it doesn't solve all the problem. It doesn't reduce inequality in an absolute way, but it reduces the gap significantly. And I don't know if you can find a good study that checks it exactly, because we have public education with us for many, many years. But if you compare what happened in the 19th centuries and the gaps within countries in the 19th century, we know that they have been, in the developed countries, they have been reduced significantly, partly because of public education.
Yes, please.
I think one of the other reasons that these cross-national comparisons of inequality and its effects on growth is significant for this conversation is because a lot of countries are pressured in the formation of their education policies by perceptions of international competition. And it's interesting, if you look, for example, so I'm curious whether you have any, I don't know that you've done any of this work yourself, but if you wanted to speculate about the argument that it's not just attainment, but it's actually the quality of what's being taught as a determinant of future economic competitiveness, productivity, growth, or economic growth. No. I mean, this is. I mean, last week, we had PISA, and this is the thing that rhetorically has a lot of influence on public policy. Do you have any thoughts about how to introduce that into all of this discussion? Well,
thoughts always, but no. But I think you're very right in the sense that what is important is not only the quantity of people who graduate, but how well educated they are. And in general, I think that the investment in public education should take care of both things. It doesn't always do it. And the question is how to measure things. And here I have less of a knowledge to answer the question. But I can only give you an example of the degree of the problems. Israel is considered to be a country that has a high expenditures on education. Something like 7% of GDP is considered to be high. And people say still, how come that we fare so badly in the PISA tests? And the answer is very simple. We put a lot of money in education, but we also have a lot of children. We're a country that relatively has a huge number of children. And if you compare us to other countries, not in terms of expenditures per GDP, but expenditures per GDP per number of children, then we're back behind many countries. We're number 33 in the world, not in the forefront. So it's no wonder that we do bad in PISA. And actually, I don't have it here, but I was participating in some conference called Caesarea, which is for policy reasons in Israel. I should have brought my own PC, actually. I should have shown you. But there I showed a very simple, again, plot of the expenditures in each country per student, per GDP per student, and the grades of PISA. And there is a very clear positive correlation. So there are no miracles. You want to have good education? You have to pay for it.
Okay, we should sort of try to wind this up because we're waiting for us for lunch. We have 2 questions. Hopefully we'll conclude after that. Yossi?
Well, just to refer to your last comment, the Americans among you will know the book Academically Adrift by Richard Arum and I forget, Josipa, I forget what. Anyway, the point of that book, it's a study of how much students learn in American colleges. And the short answer is nothing. The exact answer is somewhat more complicated, but it's not very much off the mark. So PISA is related, but academic achievements in colleges, and I'm not talking about elite colleges, because those are not the ones attended by the bulk of the American population. Rather, those that are, there is very little learning going on. I recommend that book. Now, with respect to privatization, I'm sorry, Noach, let me take just 2 more minutes. Private versus public education, it's a very tricky issue. On the one hand, we know that private education is correlated with educational expansion. I'm tempted to use the word causes, but I'll be careful, because it's client-oriented. It generates demand. It responds to the market. It lowers admissions criteria. And I'm not talking about the Harvards. I'm talking about, say, the private colleges in Korea, for example, and the private colleges in Kiryat Ono and other places like that. So privatization is a way to expand cheaply. On the other hand, privatization also subsidizes the affluent classes for obvious reasons.
Subsidizes
I mean,
or get subsidized?
I was going to say public education subsidizes, on the other hand, public education subsidizes the affluent classes, because the barriers to attendance are not always monetary. The barriers to attendance are often other things, such as aptitude, such as aspirations, such as other things. In Europe, for example, when those of us who spent time in Oxford know that Oxford, do you think Oxford is a public university or a private one? The answer, Oxford is a public university, but it's attended by the classes that would, in the US, have attended private institutions, and they pay peanuts by way of tuition fees. So it's a tricky issue, whether we go this way or that. Let's not, public education can be a very exclusionary mechanism, very much like public education elsewhere. Most European countries, very few European countries have public institutions, or at least until recently. Speaking of Italy, we spoke about Italy in the break. When I worked in Italy, there was one private institution in Italy, in Milano. Bocconi, and that was it. So anyway, I think I've made my point. Thank you.
But again, Yossi, generalizations are problematic. I mean, you know that Bocconi is really one of the best universities in Europe. And I teach in Lewis, which is also private, and I don't think that we give easy access and easy education. And also, I must say, in defense of many colleges in the U.S., I mean, I've never taught in a small college, but I have a good friend who teaches Chinese politics in Salem State College in Massachusetts, not a famous one, and I'm sure that he does a great job. So let's not get carried away. Everything is complicated still.
Okay, let's take Daniel. You wanted the last question?
Yes, it's more kind of a controversial remark. I'm sure that if we had statistics on intellectual capabilities, the distribution would look a little bit like a typical income distribution, something like log normal, with a lot of people at the low end. And I wonder whether this group should also think about the limits of this pursuit of increasing investment in education. There will probably be left quite a bit of people at the low end, and we should also think what should be done with them. Probably it's better transfer payments, and so the question
which is your job, huh?
It's my job, and I think it's an important issue to ask what are the limits of such improvement in education, because maybe there is some limit. We also know about the literature of signaling, which says that you can invest in education, you can get people get higher degrees, but there will still be a new distribution at the higher degrees.
No, just a comment. I mean, the signaling is a beautiful model by Mike Spence, which has long been proved wrong empirically by many researchers. I mean, there are many studies, including by Josh Angrist and others, that show that education has an effect on the productivity of workers and not through signaling. So let's not get carried away. But, I mean, I think the answer is very simple. There may be a limit to education, but as long as children from low class get acceptance to college at the level described in the graphs before, and can be among the 30 or 40% of those who get into college among those who were born to richer people, then we still have something to do.